I'm Carrie Filipetti, and I'm here with Anka Lee. In early 2026, U.S. forces conducted Operation Absolute Resolve, apprehending Venezuelan dictator Nicolas Maduro. Today, Anka and I will dive into what this operation means for U.S. competition with China, as well as China's growing role in the hemisphere. Anka, Chinese diplomats were reportedly meeting with Maduro right before Absolute Resolve. How did China interpret what happened on that day?
Actually, they were in the room, Carrie, just hours before Maduro was captured. And I'll say the Chinese had two reactions. The first one was they were shocked. Recall in the last few months, Panama left the Belt and Road. Recall that in Honduras, they had a presidential election. The two candidates, both of them, said maybe we'll be better off with Taiwan than China. So the Chinese felt that there was a bit of a crack in that relationship. They wanted to go there to figure out what's happening, and then it backfired. The narrative that came out wasn't exactly what Beijing had hoped for. Second was they realized that Venezuela was an already distressed asset, and it became more so. Remember that for the last 20 years, the Chinese actually put over $100 billion in Venezuela.
Much of which has not been paid back.
10 billion. And now they wonder if they will ever get it back. They don't know how this is going to spin out to other parts of the region on how they think about the relationship with China going forward. If we want to take a step back a little bit, can you please just maybe walk through what China has done for the Maduro government economically, politically, and even diplomatically?
The way that I like to think about it is, what are the key pillars that kept the Maduro regime in power? Because China is central to a significant portion of them. China was a key enabler of the sort of economic lifeline that the Maduro regime relied on. The second is the repression apparatus. And this is, I think, the most significant thing. The Miranda Center for Democracy recently put out a report called Autocracy, how the Chinese surveillance state has been exported to regimes like the Maduro regime and the Iranian regime. And here we see something really compelling, which is that part of the $100 billion in loans that the CCP provided to the Maduro regime went towards the repression apparatus. It's Chinese technology that powers the identity card used in Venezuela called the Carne de la Patria, which is often used to restrict humanitarian aid programs from going to opposition leaders. It's used as a main tool for social control. There's about 30,000 cameras that China has provided to surveil the citizens. And this is what has resulted in over 900 political prisoners in Venezuela at the start of the year. And then you look at the military support. Venezuela is the largest purchaser of Chinese military technology in the Western Hemisphere. And so again, these are all the ways that the Maduro regime was really empowered and enabled. What would you say is China's broader interest in Latin America, and why invest so much within countries that are so geographically diverse from Beijing?
China basically over the last 20 years went to Latin America to get what it needed for future growth for the next generation. They were a $1 trillion economy in 2000. Last year, they were $20 trillion, roughly. So that's a tremendous amount of growth in 20 years. They needed a lot of resources. In 20 years, I think the outbound foreign direct investment from Beijing to Latin America tops $600 billion. That is 20% of China's outbound total. And 80% of what Latin America exported to China were basically minerals, agriculture products, metals. The other direction was not balanced. The 70% of what Latin America imported from China were electronics, machineries, textile. So it was, in many ways, an extractive relationship. There are 40 Confucius Institutes throughout Latin America. Now, these are educational, scholarship-like institutions housed in many cases at universities, but they have an agenda set by the Chinese Communist Party. So it was a way to socialize China's narrative, to influence how people thought about Chinese policies, and in the end, buy some friends in the elite level. You've been on the ground a lot in the region. I'm just curious, from your experience, what does Chinese influence actually look like to everyday people? What do they see?
They very much are aware of what China's trying to do in their countries. They understand it's, as you said, extractive, that it's a really one-sided relationship and they don't benefit from it. So this is why it's often the case that these countries would much rather partner with the United States. The issue is we need to actually give them an alternative to partner with. And this has been something that has been a real challenge for American businesses. There's a lot of things that we've done to try try to reform that in the last couple of years, make it easier for US companies to get involved. This is why democracy in Venezuela is so important, because rule of law is essential for the stability for these corporations to operate. But the good news is that most everyday citizens really do want to see partnership with the United States as opposed to with China. Beyond the trade and investment piece, there's also the sort of regional infrastructure and multilateral infrastructure that China has begun to implement. And I'm just curious from your perspective, how China has really shaped those forums, their multilateral engagements, and how you see that playing with US influence in the hemisphere.
I think there are two things that Beijing wants to do. One is to set the tone without the United States in the region. Second is, how does Beijing build a parallel future in the region without the United States, right? And it's important because if you own the narrative, you own the agenda. If you think about how Xi Jinping has organized his thoughts about global diplomacy and how China can advance its own diplomatic agenda, he's really interested in five things. He's interested in governance, development, civilization, security, and then he's interested in Belt and Road Initiative. China seems to be organizing a lot of the discussions at CELAC around these five pillars. They are trying to shape what these countries talk about, how they talk about it, and what issues to address.
This is sort of a shift for China, as I understand it, right? I mean, there's an 85% increase in Chinese nationals working at the United Nations, for example, over a period of just 2 years, 2019 to 2021.
That's right.
And we see how they use that influence to shape what the UN talks about. So you've seen this very clear shift in the CCP's mentality on how to use these systems.
I love what you said about language, because language really matters in how you shape policy. The Chinese have been trying to move the language around and say economic rights is more important than human rights.
Right. And I think the core thing for the US to do is to make sure that we're creating an alternative, that we are still speaking about human rights, that we are still speaking about democracy. There's more opportunities for investment in the region, and hopefully people will start partnering with the United States versus partnering with China.
We hear a lot about countering influence, but what does a sustainable US policy look like?
Well, there's a couple of things that I think are being done and other things that I think need to be done. So on the one hand, the president sees what happens in the Western Hemisphere is directly linked to US national security interests. I think that's important. It shows that there's a tangible outcome for the United States based on our policies in the region. The second thing that I think we really need to do, and it's part of that positive agenda, is soft power.
Right.
Particularly things like broadcasting. You mentioned the Confucius Institutes. It's really important that we understand that the CCP spends more money on its United Front, its information operations activities, than it does on its foreign ministry.
They call it the magic weapon, actually.
They understand how important it is. We don't understand
That's
that.
right.
I'm talking about making sure that there is a voice that counters the authoritarian voices that China is spreading, counters the anti-American voices that China is spreading. And then lastly, enforcing sanctions is really important here. I think we can really develop a closer relationship with the region and successfully push back China. It's definitely within the realm of possibility. One area where I know that we've struggled has been in the Taiwan context.
That's right.
Because a lot of countries in the Western Hemisphere did recognize Taiwan. And over the last few years, we've seen a significant drop off of those countries. So I'm trying to understand what more could be done to shore up Taiwan's place in Latin America.
You mentioned a lot about soft power, about the positive story of what democracies can bring to the people in the region. I think Taiwan can be a very critical part of the equation. And I think the United States can truly work with Taiwan in thinking through, how do we make sure we can demonstrate the visible nature of what Taiwan can do for a lot of these countries and communities? I'll give you one example. In Paraguay, they actually recently sent 30 electric buses. They're also going to spend $30 million to build a manufacturing plant in that country, to build those electric buses, not just to ship buses, but to actually have them built on the ground. You're talking about jobs. You're talking about economic development, and you're talking about an industrial-based potential in the future that is good for the people. I think that's the kind of thing we can see Taiwan doing a lot more, because you're making friends locally. You're demonstrating Taiwan can actually contribute to the future of these countries. And with that, I think that's how political capital is earned in the long run. And I think that's what we should focus on. The positive story of the United States, the positive story of Taiwan, and the positive story of democracies is what we want to be getting at in the end. I think this is really exactly the kind of conversation we should be having in the Wilson Center. I'm so glad that we had this discussion on not just Venezuela, but Latin America. Hopefully we'll have more to come in the future.